The air backstage was thick and heavy, smelling of old paint, sawdust, and the faint, sweet scent of the perfume the young comedian before her had sprayed into the air. It was a smell that belonged to a different world, a world of bright lights and loud laughter. For Eleanor, it felt like breathing in someone else's life. Her palms were damp, and she wiped them on the soft fabric of her dress for the 10th time. A little shiver, not from the cold, traced its way down her spine. The simple lavender dress, one she'd worn to church and family gatherings for years, suddenly felt like a costume she had no right to wear. Beside her, her granddaughter Maya was practically vibrating with energy. 16 years old and full of a bright, unwavering belief in things that Eleanor had long since stopped believing in. Maya's sneaker was tapping out an impatient rhythm on the dusty concrete floor, her eyes fixed on the heavy velvet curtain that separated them from the stage. "You're going to be amazing," Grandma Maya whispered, her voice a puff of warm air in the cool, dim space. She reached out and straightened the simple pearl necklace around Eleanor's neck, her fingers quick and sure. "Just like in the kitchen?" Eleanor offered a weak smile. In the kitchen, singing was a private thing. It was the soundtrack to kneading bread, to stirring a pot of soup, to folding laundry still warm from the dryer. It was a quiet comfort, a soft hum that filled the silence of the house since her husband had been gone. It was not for this, not for a stage, not for an audience. She remembered the afternoon a few weeks ago with perfect, cringe-worthy clarity. Maya had come home from school, her face alight with a flyer clutched in her hand. "The annual Hometown Talent Showcase," she had announced, waving the colorful paper under Eleanor's nose. "You have to do it." Eleanor had laughed, a real, deep laugh that surprised them both. "Oh, honey, no. That's for you young folks. For people who can actually dance or play the guitar, but you have a talent." Maya had insisted, her brow furrowed with the kind of earnest determination only a teenager can possess. "Your voice. You sound like one of those old records Dad plays. The really good ones." And just like that, it had been decided. Not by Eleanor, but by the sheer force of Maya's will. A promise had been extracted, a mix of guilt and affection, making Eleanor agree. "Just to get her to stop pestering me," Eleanor had told her son on the phone later, but they both knew it was more than that. It was hard to say no to the girl who looked at her like she was a treasure, not just a quiet old woman puttering about her garden. So, she had practiced. Not in the kitchen, where the sounds felt safe and private, but in the living room, standing tall, imagining a room full of empty chairs. It had felt awkward and exposed, the notes hanging in the air. Bare and alone. From out on the stage, a wave of applause and cheers erupted. The hip-hop crew had just finished their routine. They were a whirlwind of bright colors and dizzying moves, and the crowd, packed with their friends and family, had gone wild. Eleanor peeked through a small gap in the curtain. The stage was awash in neon lights, and the crew was taking their bows, breathless and triumphant. They looked so young, so confident. They belonged here. She felt a century older than her 78 years. After them came a young man with an electric guitar. He played with such ferocity that Eleanor felt the vibrations in the floorboards. The music was a wall of sound, aggressive and loud. The crowd loved it, bobbing their heads and cheering for the raw energy of it all. Each act was a burst of youthful dynamism. They were loud, they were fast, and they were exactly what a modern audience had come to see. She was a quiet ballad in a world of rock anthems. Maya squeezed her hand. "They're going to love you," she said, her voice full of a certainty that Eleanor desperately wished she could borrow. "They just don't know it yet." Eleanor just nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She thought of her husband, Robert. He had been the one who truly loved her voice. He was the one who would stop what he was doing just to listen, his eyes closed, a soft smile on his face. "You sound like an angel, Ellie," he would say, using the name only he ever called her. Singing was something they shared. After he passed, the music had become softer, more like a whisper, a way to still talk to him when the house felt too big and too empty. Singing on this stage, in front of all these people, felt like sharing their secret with the world. It felt like betrayal almost. But then she looked at Maya, who was watching her with such fierce, protective love. This wasn't about Robert. This was for her. For the girl who saw a spark in her grandmother that she herself thought had gone out. Maybe, just maybe, this was for Eleanor too. A chance to prove to herself that there was still something more to her life than just memories and routine. The stage lights dimmed, and a single spotlight cut through the darkness, aimed at the center of the stage. A man with a big voice and a cheap suit, the host of the show, walked out to a smattering of applause. "All right, folks, we've seen some incredible energy tonight," he boomed, his voice echoing slightly in the old hall. "We've had you dancing in your seats. But now we're going to slow things down a bit. We're going to take it back. A little trip down memory lane, if you will." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. This was it. He was about to say her name. For our final act before the intermission, the host continued, his tone turning slightly patronizing, the kind of voice people use when talking to small children or beloved pets. "We have a very special performer. A lovely lady who is a true treasure of our community. Let's give a warm, welcoming hand to Eleanor Vance." There it was. Her name spoken into the air. A ripple of soft snickers and quiet whispers spread through the audience. It wasn't malicious. Not really. It was the sound of fond condescension. They were expecting a sweet, fragile old lady to shakily sing an old-fashioned song. They were ready to be polite, to smile and nod and give her a pity applause. They saw a novelty act, not a talent. Eleanor heard it all, and a hot flush of shame washed over her. Her first instinct was to turn and run, to hide in the dusty backstage and let Maya make their apologies. But then she looked at her granddaughter one last time. Maya's face wasn't pitying or condescending. It was full of shining, unwavering faith. She gave Eleanor's hand one last hard squeeze and mouthed the words, "You got this." Taking a deep, shaky breath that did little to calm her racing heart, Eleanor released Maya's hand. She smoothed down the front of her lavender dress, her fingers tracing the familiar, worn seam. The piano player, a kindly-looking man with gray hair, caught her eye from his place at the grand piano and gave her a small, encouraging nod. The stage manager gestured her forward. There was no more time to think. There was only the heavy curtain, the bright light, and the sea of expectant, patronizing faces waiting on the other side. With her back straight and her chin held high, Eleanor Vance stepped out from the darkness and into the light. Asterisk. The walk from the heavy curtain to the single microphone stand in the center of the stage felt like the longest journey Eleanor had ever taken. The floorboards seemed to stretch and bend beneath her sensible shoes. The single spotlight was a hot white eye, blinding her to everything beyond its immediate circle. She could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on her, a palpable pressure that made her want to shrink into herself. The lavender dress, usually a source of comfort, now felt thin and flimsy, offering no protection from the quiet judgment in the room. The audience, a shadowy mass beyond the light, was a blur of faces and colors, their murmurs a low, indifferent hum. She could hear the rustle of programs, the clink of a glass, a soft cough. These were the sounds of people waiting, patiently, for the nice little old lady to finish her sweet little song so the real entertainment could continue. She reached the microphone and rested, trembling hands on the cold metal stand. The slight tremor in her fingers traveled up her arms. She leaned in close, the scent of dust and old metal filling her nostrils. For a moment, her mind went completely blank. The song, the words, the melody, all of it vanished, leaving a terrifying void. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. A fresh wave of panic washed over her. Out in the darkness, she heard a few titters, the kind of sound people make when they feel a little awkward for you. Then, from the wings, she saw it. A small movement, a flash of color. It was Maya, giving her a quick, double thumbs up. The sight of her granddaughter's unshakable faith was a lifeline. It was enough to pull her back from the edge of the panic. She took a slow, careful breath, the way she did when she was trying to coax a shy seedling from the soil. She had to do this. For Maya. And, maybe just a little for herself. She leaned closer to the microphone, her voice barely a whisper, thin and fragile as a spider's web. "Hello," she said, the crackle of her own voice in the speakers startling her. I'm Eleanor Vance." She paused, gathering herself. "I'm going to sing an old song for you tonight. It's called Cry Me a River." A louder ripple of chuckles and amused whispers spread through the auditorium. An old woman singing a song about heartbreak and rivers of tears. The irony was too much for some. Eleanor flinched, but she forced herself to keep her eyes fixed on the dusty floor. "Don't look at them," she told herself. "Just sing the song." She glanced over at the pianist, who gave her a gentle, reassuring nod. He placed his fingers on the keys, and the first quiet, melancholy notes of the intro drifted into the hall. It was a familiar sound, a song she had known for most of her life. As the simple, sad melody filled the space, Eleanor did what she always did when she sang. She closed her eyes. She shut out the blinding light, the sea of faces, the stuffy air, and the memory of their laughter. She was no longer on a stage in a community hall. She was back in her small, cozy kitchen. The afternoon sun streaming through the window, the smell of baking bread in the air. She was singing for herself and for Robert. She opened her mouth to sing the first line. "Now you say you're lonely, ... The voice that came out was not the frail, reedy whisper of her introduction. It was not the nervous, trembling sound of a woman on the verge of running away. It was clear, and it was warm, like a deep stream flowing smooth over polished stones. It had a soft, mellow quality to it, a richness that seemed to hang in the air, untouched by the nervous energy that possessed her body. The quiet, indifferent hum of the audience ceased instantly. It was as if someone had flipped a switch. The whispers died. The rustling of programs stopped. The people who had been leaning back in their seats, ready to be politely entertained, suddenly leaned forward. A confused, curious silence settled over the room. Heads tilted, eyebrows furrowed. People looked at each other, their expressions a silent question. Is that really her? The host, who had retreated to the side of the stage and was checking the schedule on his clipboard, looked up, his face a mask of surprise. He stared at the small, lavender-clad woman, his mouth slightly agape. Eleanor, lost in her world, was oblivious. She sang the next line, her voice unwavering. "You cried the whole night long." As she moved into the next verse, something began to shift. The warmth in her voice deepened, taking on a new color. It was the color of memory. As she sang about being lonely and mistreated, she wasn't just reading words from a page. She was pulling from a well that was 78 years deep. She was remembering the sting of a childhood argument, the fear of her first day at a new job, the quiet ache of missing her parents, the devastating hollow feeling of the day the doctors gave them the bad news about Robert. Her voice was carrying all of it, not in a dramatic, showy way, but in a subtle, heartbreaking texture that was undeniable. The pianist, a seasoned professional who had played with countless amateur singers, was listening with an expression of dawning wonder. He had been prepared to offer gentle, simple support. But this voice didn't need it. It was a voice that could stand on its own. He began to play with more feeling, adding little flourishes and nuances, his fingers dancing on the keys in a respectful duet, with the sound emerging from the woman at the microphone. He was no longer just an accompanist. He was a listener, captivated like everyone else in the audience. A young woman who had been whispering to her boyfriend about getting another drink put her phone down on her lap, her gaze fixed on the stage. A group of teenagers who had been scrolling through their social media feeds looked up, their expressions shifting from boredom to disbelief. An old man in the third row, who had come to support the hip-hop crew his grandson was in, slowly took off his glasses, cleaning them with a handkerchief as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing and hearing. The image of the frail, sweet old woman and the sound of this powerful, soulful voice were creating a beautiful, confusing paradox in their minds. They had come to a talent showcase, but this felt like something more. It felt real. Then, Eleanor reached the chorus. This was the moment the song built to its first peak. The simple sadness of the verses, gave way to a more powerful, declarative emotion. "You're gonna cry me a river, ... And as she sang that line, the transformation was complete. The warm, clear voice blossomed. It didn't just get louder, it got bigger. It filled every corner of the hall, a wave of pure, unadulterated sound that was both thrilling and immense. It was a voice that was not just singing the words, but living them. It was a voice that commanded the room, not with aggression, but with an undeniable, magnetic authority. When she hit the next line, "Cry me a river," her voice soared, carrying a weight of sorrow and strength that was breathtaking. It was the sound of a heart that had been broken but had learned to beat again, stronger than before. It was a sound so full of life and experience that it felt like it was telling a whole story with every single note. The audience was utterly silenced. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound in the entire auditorium was the piano and the incredible voice of the woman they had so readily dismissed. The Snickers were forgotten. The condescending smiles were gone, replaced by looks of pure awe. Phones that had been in pockets and purses were now being held up, not to mock, but to capture, to preserve this unexpected, magical moment. The grandmother they saw on stage was vanishing, replaced by an artist they had never known existed. And in that moment, as her voice filled the hall and changed everything, Eleanor Vance wasn't just singing a song. She was finally being heard, asterisk the moment Eleanor's voice soared into the chorus. The world in the auditorium shifted on its axis. The silence that followed the initial surprise was no longer born of confusion, but of pure, unadulterated reverence. The hundreds of people in the audience, who had been a collection of individuals just moments before, had now merged into a single, breathing entity. All focused on the small woman at the center of the spotlight. The air, which had been thick with anticipation and condescension, was now electric, with a current of shared emotion. Eleanor, her eyes still closed, was no longer just a performer. She had become a vessel. She wasn't thinking about the notes, or the words, or the audience. She wasn't thinking about her trembling hands or the lavender dress or the fear that had paralyzed her moments before. She was just feeling. The song was no longer a piece of music she had chosen to sing. It was a part of her soul, laid bare. As she moved into the bridge, her voice took on a new texture, a conversational intimacy that was both powerful and heartbreaking. She sang the lines about telling her love she was sorry, and her voice dipped, becoming soft and almost conspiratorial. It was the sound of a late-night phone call, of whispered apologies and broken promises. In the fourth row, a woman reached into her purse and pulled out a crumpled tissue, dabbing at the corners of her eyes. She wasn't just hearing a song anymore. She was remembering a conversation from 20 years ago, one that still had the power to make her heart ache. Eleanor's voice was unlocking things in people, things they had tucked away safely in the back of their minds. The pianist watched her. His own expression, a mixture of concentration and awe. He was no longer just playing the chords on the sheet music. He was following her, listening to the subtle shifts in her tone, the way she held a note just a fraction of a second longer than written. The breath she took before a particularly painful line. He softened his touch on the keys, the melody becoming more fluid, more empathetic. He was no longer accompanying Eleanor. He was in conversation with her, responding to the story her voice was telling. It was a partnership, forged not in rehearsal, but in the raw, honest reality of this single performance. The song was building again, heading toward its final, powerful declaration. This was the climax, the moment where the singer let it all go, where the sorrow and the strength and the defiance all came together in one final, breathtaking surge. And Eleanor was ready. She had traveled through the landscape of the song, from the quiet, lonely valleys of the verses to the swelling rivers of the choruses. And now she was approaching the highest peak. She opened her eyes. It was the first time she had truly seen the audience since she had stepped onto the stage. The blinding spotlight softened at the edges, and the shadowy figures beyond it came into focus. She saw faces, not just a blur. She saw the woman with the tissue. She saw the old man who had taken off his glasses. She saw the teenagers with their phones held high, their faces rapt with attention. She saw the host standing at the side of the stage, his jaw still slack with amazement. And she saw in the wings Maya, her face a beautiful, tear-streaked picture of pride and joy. In that moment, seeing them all, seeing them really listening, something broke loose inside her. It wasn't a painful break, but a liberating one. It was the last of her fear, the last of her self-doubt, the last of the feeling that she was a fraud who didn't belong here. She saw their faces and she understood. They weren't judging her. They were with her. They were traveling down her river of tears with her, and her voice answered their silent call. She took a breath, a deep, full breath that seemed to draw energy from the entire room. And then she sang the final lines. "Told me you were sorry. Told me you were sorry." Her voice was no longer just warm or clear or big. It was incandescent. It was a sound so pure and so potent that it felt almost physical. It was a sound that could shatter glass and heal a broken heart all at once. It was a voice that held not just the sadness of her own life, but the echoes of every sad song ever sung, every heart ever broken, every tear ever shed. It was the sound of human experience, distilled into one perfect, soaring note. It filled the auditorium, not like a loud noise, but like a warmth that spread through every single person, wrapping around them, holding them close. When she hit the final, devastatingly beautiful line, the note hung in the air, shimmering and alive. She held it, not with the effort of a trained singer, but with the effortless power of someone who is channeling something far greater than themselves. It was a note that seemed to stretch time itself. No one wanted it to end. The pianist held his fingers suspended above the keys, afraid to break the spell. The audience held its collective breath, their hearts caught in their throats, and then finally she let it go. The note faded, not with a tremble, but with a gentle, graceful release, like a feather drifting down to the ground. The final sound from the piano was a soft, resolving chord that echoed in the profound silence that followed. For 3 full seconds, the auditorium was completely still. It was a sacred silence, the kind of silence that follows a profound and shared experience. No one coughed. No one rustled a program. No one moved. They were all frozen in the moment, letting the beauty of what they had just witnessed settle over them, sink into their bones. The lights seemed to dim on their own, as if to honor the quiet. The air, which had been so thick with expectation just a few minutes ago, was now clean and clear. Carrying only the ghost of a song that had touched every soul in the room, Eleanor stood at the microphone, her chest heaving slightly, her eyes still fixed on the audience. The journey was over. She was back on the stage, a 78-year-old woman in a simple lavender dress. But something was different. She felt different. The fear was gone. The shakiness was gone. In its place was a feeling of calm, serene power. She looked out at the sea of faces, and for the first time in a very long time, she didn't feel like she was just Robert's widow or Maya's grandmother. She felt like Eleanor Vance, and for the first time that felt like more than enough. The silence was broken by a single sound, a sob. It was a soft, wet sound, coming from the woman in the 4th row. She had buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. The sound seemed to break a dam. Another person, a man in the back, let out a loud, shaky wow. Then, like a single spark in a dry forest, the applause began. It started with one person clapping, then another and another. It wasn't a polite, scattered clap. It was a series of sharp, definite bursts of sound, each one a testament to the power of what they had just heard. Within seconds, the scattered claps merged into a single, deafening roar. It was not just applause. It was an explosion. It was a physical wave of sound that washed over the stage, so loud it made the floorboards vibrate. A young man in the front row jumped to his feet, clapping his hands above his head. His movement was contagious. Another person stood up. Then another and another. Within moments, the entire audience was on its feet. The standing ovation was not a slow, respectful rise. It was an instantaneous, explosive surge of appreciation. People were cheering, whistling, yelling, brava, and amazing. Tears were streaming down faces, from the young to the old. Phones were still held aloft, but now they were recording the incredible reaction. Trying to capture the energy, it was pouring from the stage and the audience in equal measure. Eleanor's eyes widened in sheer unadulterated shock. She blinked, as if she couldn't quite process what was happening. The sound was overwhelming, a tidal wave of love and admiration. Her hand flew to her mouth, a gesture of pure, heartfelt disbelief. She looked from the sea of standing, cheering people to the host, who was now running onto the stage, his face beaming, and then to the wings. Maya burst through the curtain, tears streaming down her face. A smile so wide it looked like it might split her face in two. She didn't hesitate. She ran straight to her grandmother and threw her arms around her, burying her face in the soft fabric of the lavender dress. Eleanor wrapped her arms around the girl, holding her tight, her own tears now falling freely. They were not tears of fear or sadness, but tears of pure, uncontainable joy. The host approached the microphone, his voice filled with an emotion that was a stark contrast to the condescending tone he had used earlier. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice nearly drowned out by the continuing cheers, "I think I speak for everyone here tonight when I say we have just witnessed something truly special. Give it up one more time for the incredible, the amazing Eleanor Vance." The crowd roared even louder. Eleanor, still clinging to her granddaughter, finally looked out at them. She took Maya's hand, and together they took a bow. It was a deep, humble bow, but as Eleanor straightened up, her back was straight, her head was held high, and a smile of pure, radiant happiness lit up her face. The woman who had walked onto this stage a bundle of nerves was standing there now, basking in the glow of 1,000 adoring lights, a star in her own right. Her voice had changed everything. The applause didn't just fade. It seemed to physically press in on Eleanor, a warm, overwhelming force. It was a sound she had only ever heard coming from a television, sound for other people, for famous singers in grand concert halls. To be at the center of it felt utterly surreal. Maya's arms were still wrapped around her, a lifeline of pure joy, and for a long moment, Eleanor just held her, letting the waves of adoration wash over them both. The host, a man whose name she couldn't even remember, was at her side, his earlier condescension completely replaced by a look of genuine, almost reverential respect. "Eleanor, that was something I will never forget," he said into his microphone, his voice thick with emotion. He turned to the audience. "I think we need to hear that again, don't you?" The crowd roared its agreement, a thunderous yes that shook the building. Eleanor's eyes widened in panic. Again, she couldn't. The emotional well she had drawn from felt like it had run completely dry. She had given everything she had, and now there was nothing left. She shook her head, a small, frantic motion, and leaned closer to Maya. Honey, I can't do it again." Ass seemed to understand immediately. She pulled back, her face streaked with tears, but her expression firm and protective. She turned to the host, and though her voice was too soft to be heard by the audience, her message was clear. The man who had been gesturing for the pianist to start the music saw the look on the girl's face and nodded in understanding. He put a gentle hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "Of course. You've given us more than enough. Let's just enjoy this moment." He continued to praise her, to tell the audience how lucky they were, but Eleanor barely heard him. Her world had shrunk to the stage, to the incredible, impossible reality of the standing ovation that just wouldn't end. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she allowed Maya to guide her toward the wings. As she stepped back into the familiar darkness of the backstage area, the roar of the crowd followed her, a living thing that refused to be contained by the curtains. The moment she was out of sight, her legs seemed to turn to water. She stumbled, and Maya, with surprising strength, caught her and helped her lower herself onto an old wooden crate. "Oh, Grandma," Maya whispered, her voice a huff of wonder. "Did you hear them? They loved you." Eleanor could only nod, her breath coming in short, shaky gasps. She put a hand to her chest right over her heart, which was still hammering away like a trapped bird. It wasn't from fear anymore. It was from a kind of pure, unadulterated shock. Her hands, which had been trembling with nerves just minutes before, were now trembling with a leftover energy, a vibration from the incredible sound she had been a part of. Then came the hip-hop crew, a whirlwind of sweat and bright colors. Their leader, a young man with a kind smile, extended a hand. "That was unreal, Ms. Vance," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "Seriously, unreal. You blew us all away." The rest of the group nodded in agreement, their earlier cool confidence replaced by a look of humble respect. They saw her not as an old lady who sang a song, but as a fellow artist who had just delivered a masterclass in performance. Backstage, Eleanor's son, Thomas, and daughter-in-law were waiting. They had been in the audience, their expectations as low as everyone else's. They were there to support their daughter and to humor their mother-in-law. Now, their faces were a mixture of shock, pride, and a deep, bewildered wonder. Laura rushed to her side, her eyes wet. "Eleanor, my goodness. We had no idea. We had absolutely no idea." Thomas just stood there for a moment, shaking his head in disbelief. He was a quiet, practical man, a man of numbers and facts. What he had just witnessed defied all logic. It was a miracle. "Mom," he finally managed to say, his voice thick. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." He looked at his mother, the woman who made him soup when he was sick and tended to her garden with a quiet, steady rhythm, and he felt like he was seeing her for the very first time. The realization that his own mother held this kind of magic inside her, a magic he had never known was there, was both humbling and profound. The drive home that night was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the usual comfortable silence of a family that knew each other's thoughts. It was a charged, vibrant, quiet, filled with the unspoken echoes of the performance. Maya sat in the back, fiddling with her phone, a small, secret smile on her face as she rewatched the video she had recorded. In the front passenger seat, Eleanor stared out the window, watching the dark streets of her small town blur past. She felt bone-deep tired, but it was a good kind of tired, kind that comes after a day of hard, rewarding work. Her mind kept replaying the moment. The sound of the applause, the feeling of Maya's arms around her, the look on her son's face. It felt like a dream. She kept expecting to wake up in her own bed, the memory of it fading like mist in the morning sun. The next morning, the dream proved to be very, very real. She woke up to the smell of coffee and the sound of Maya's excited voice coming from the kitchen. Eleanor walked in to find her granddaughter pacing back and forth, her phone held up like a trophy. "Grandma, you have to see this," Maya said, her eyes sparkling. "It's everywhere." She took the phone. The screen showed a social media page. The video was titled simply, "Grandma's Song at the Hometown Showcase." It had been posted late the night. The number next to it, a small heart with K next to it, made Eleanor frown. She didn't understand. "What does that mean, honey?" "It means thousands, Grandma. Thousands of likes," Maya practically shouted. "And look at the comments." Eleanor put on her reading glasses and squinted at the tiny letters. The comments poured in, a river of words she could barely comprehend. "I was there. I cried. Not just a little bit. I sobbed. I've never heard anything like it. Who is this woman? She needs a record deal. Now. My grandmother passed away last year. Hearing this voice, it feels like I got to hear her sing one more time. Thank you. I'm a 19-year-old metalhead, and I just listened to this on repeat for an hour. This is pure, raw soul. Forget auto-tune. This is the real deal." It's the way the whole room just went silent. You could feel the magic through the screen. Chills. Actual chills. Eleanor scrolled through comment after comment, her heart pounding with a strange, new kind of fear. These weren't just the polite words of her friends and neighbors. This was the world, strangers, and they were all talking about her. The private comfort she had kept to herself for so long was now public property, being dissected and praised by people she would never meet. It was terrifying. And it was also, she had to admit, a little bit thrilling. The phone began to ring, and it didn't stop. It was the local radio station, wanting to do an interview. It was the town's community newspaper, wanting to write a story. It was the producer of the showcase, calling to personally congratulate her and offer her a spot at the upcoming holiday concert. The quiet, predictable rhythm of Eleanor's life had been completely shattered, replaced by a cacophony of ringing phones and buzzing notifications. A few days later, a small, neatly folded newspaper was left on her doorstep. Eleanor picked it up, her hands feeling a little shaky again. There she was, on the front page. It wasn't a picture of her holding a prize-winning pumpkin or posing with her church group. It was a photo taken from the stage, mid-song. Her eyes were closed, her head tilted back, her mouth open, a look of pure, transcendent emotion on her face. And above the photo, in bold, black letters, is the headline, "The Voice That Silenced a Town. Millfield's own Eleanor Vance becomes an overnight sensation." She read the article. The writer spoke of her voice steeped in the rich soil of a life fully lived, and her performance that transcended a simple talent show to become a moment of shared, unvarnished humanity. The words were beautiful, but they felt like they were written about someone else. Eleanor Vance, the quiet widow who liked to garden and bake, didn't sound like this person. This person was an artist, an overnight sensation. The fame, even the small-town kind, was disorienting. When she went to the grocery store, people stopped her in the produce aisle. "Ms. Vance, my wife and I were at the show. It was incredible," said a man holding a head of lettuce. "Can you sing something for us right now?" asked a young woman, her phone already out and recording. Eleanor just smiled politely, her heart racing, and mumbled something about needing to find the potatoes. She felt like a celebrity, a character in a story that was happening to someone else. But for every moment of awkward panic was a moment of pure, heartfelt connection that made it all worthwhile. A week after the show, a young woman showed up at her front door. She was the woman from the audience, the one who had been crying. "I hope I'm not bothering you," the woman said, twisting a tissue in her hands. I had to come and thank you in person. My husband. He left me last month. I've been in such a dark place. But hearing you sing that song, it was like you were singing my story. It hurt, but it also felt like I wasn't alone anymore. It made me feel like I could get through it." Eleanor invited her in for tea, and they sat at her kitchen table, the same one where she had hummed her quiet songs for years. As the woman talked, Eleanor listened, and she realized that the magic wasn't just in her voice. The magic was in the sharing. The magic was in how a piece of her own story, her own pain, could reach out and touch someone else's. The private comfort she had kept for herself had, once shared, become a public comfort for others. Her son, Thomas, watched this transformation with a quiet, steady pride. He saw how the initial terror was slowly being replaced by a new, burgeoning confidence. He saw the way his mother held her head a little higher when she walked down the street, the way a new, vibrant light had returned to her eyes that had been dim for far too long. He and Laura helped her sort through the invitations, the interview requests, and the messages, offering a calm, practical presence in the midst of the joyful chaos. One evening, Eleanor stood in her living room, looking at a framed photograph of her and Robert on their wedding day. He was smiling, his eyes full of love for the young woman beside him. She missed him with a sharp, sudden ache that could still take her breath away. But as she looked at the photo, she didn't just feel the sadness of his absence. She felt a new feeling too, a feeling of gratitude. "You always said I had an angel's voice, Robert," she whispered to the quiet room. "I think I'm finally starting to understand what you meant." Her secret was out. Her voice was no longer just a whisper in the dark. It was a song that was being heard, and in the hearing of it, her own world had grown bigger, brighter, and more full of music than she had ever dared to imagine. The woman who had snickered at her was gone. In her place was an audience, waiting for the next note. And Eleanor Vance was finally ready to sing it. Asterisk. The fame that descended upon Eleanor Vance was not a tidal wave that crashed and receded, but rather a slow, rising tide that gently, but irrevocably, changed the landscape of her life. The initial whirlwind of calls and interviews gradually settled into a more manageable rhythm. The local newspaper article was picked up by a larger regional paper. And from there, it found its way onto a few national entertainment websites that specialized in human interest stories. Her video, which had already amassed a staggering number of views, saw a new spike in popularity. But Eleanor didn't chase the fame. Fame had come to her small town, and she decided how she would greet it. Her first public performance after the showcase was not in a grand hall or on a professional stage. It was at her own church on a Sunday morning. The pastor, a warm and kind man who had known Eleanor for decades, had asked her if she would consider singing a solo for the service. He had been in the audience that night, and he told her that the spirit of her song stayed with him all week. Eleanor was more nervous for this than she had been for the showcase. This was her community. These were the people she saw at the grocery store, the post office, the town bake sale. They knew her not as the voice of Millfield, but as Eleanor from the third pew, the quiet woman who brought a casserole when someone was sick. The thought of singing for them, putting her heart on the line in front of people she saw every day, was terrifying. But Maya, as always, was her anchor. "They already love you, Grandma," she said, as she helped Eleanor choose a simple navy blue dress for the service. "This isn't about proving anything. It's just about sharing," so Eleanor agreed. She chose to sing a simple, reverent hymn, one that everyone in the congregation knew by heart. When she stood at the front of the church, there was no spotlight, no stage curtain to hide behind. There was just the soft light filtering through the stained glass windows and the familiar, kind faces of her neighbors and friends. Her voice, when it came, was not the soaring, powerful force from the talent show. It was softer, gentler, more intimate. It was a gift offered, not a performance delivered. It was a voice that spoke of faith, of quiet strength, of a lifetime of belonging. When she finished, the silence in the church was deep and peaceful. There was no explosive applause. Instead, there was a soft, collective amen, a sound more powerful and moving to her than any standing ovation. Afterwards, people didn't swarm her for autographs. They came up to her, one by one, and took her hand. "Thank you, Eleanor," an elderly man whispered. "That was beautiful." A mother with a crying baby in her arms simply smiled and patted Eleanor's arm, a shared understanding passing between them. It was a different kind of praise, and it felt more real than anything she had experienced before. This became her new pattern. She didn't book concerts or seek out managers. Instead, she began to sing for the people in her own backyard. The local veterans' home invited her to come and sing for their residents. She arrived on a sunny afternoon, armed with a stack of old songbooks, and sang in their common room. She sang the songs they had grown up with, the songs they had danced to with their sweethearts, the songs they had listened to on the radio during the war. She sang Moon River for a man who told her it was his and his late wife's song. She saw old men, weathered and stoic, with tears glistening in their eyes as they remembered a time when they were young. A nurse told her later, "You brought them back today." For a little while, they weren't in this room. They were home. Then came an invitation that was both strange and wonderful. A blues band, a group of younger musicians from the next town over, was playing a gig at the town hall. They had seen her video online, and they were deeply impressed. Their lead singer called her, his voice filled with a respectful, almost awestruck energy. He asked if she would be willing to be their opening act. They wanted to give her a proper stage, a professional sound system, and a real audience. Eleanor's first instinct was to say no. It was too much. She was a grandmother, not an opening act. But then she thought about the pianist from the showcase, about the young people in the hip-hop crew. She thought about the kind, respectful way they had treated her, not as a novelty, but as a fellow artist. These musicians were offering her the same respect. She decided to be brave. The night of the show at the town hall was different. The audience was younger, a mix of college students and young professionals who had come to see the band. They didn't know her as Eleanor from church. They knew her as the viral grandma. She felt their curious eyes on her as she walked onto the stage. But this time, she wasn't afraid. She stood at the microphone, looked out at the sea of young faces, and felt a new kind of confidence. She wasn't here to be a sweet old lady. She was here to sing. She chose a different song this time, something with a little more swing, a little more sass. As she sang, she saw them leaning in, their expressions of curiosity melting into appreciation, then into outright enjoyment. By the end of her set, they were clapping along, cheering, and when she finished, they gave her a standing ovation that was just as loud and heartfelt as the one at the showcase. When the band came on stage later, their lead singer pointed to her sitting at a small table in the back with Maya. "Let's hear it one more time for the incredible, the amazing Ms. Eleanor Vance." The crowd roared, and a young woman with bright pink hair turned around and gave Eleanor a huge, genuine smile. It was a bridge, she realized, a bridge between her world and theirs. Built from a few simple chords and a voice that refused to be kept in a box. The most profound change, however, was happening within the walls of her own home. The singing that had once been a private whisper, a secret comfort, was now a part of the daily soundtrack of their lives. But it had changed. It was no longer just Eleanor humming to herself as she pottered around. It had become an activity of connection, a language spoken between her and Maya. One rainy afternoon, they were in the living room, a fire crackling in the hearth. Maya was scrolling through songs on her tablet, looking for a new one for Eleanor to learn. "How about this one, Grandma?" she asked, playing a snippet of an old jazz standard. "It's got all these tricky notes. Think you could do it?" Eleanor listened, her head cocked. That's a challenge," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. "Let's see." Instead of just learning it on her own, she began to teach it to Maya. "Listen here," Eleanor said, humming a complicated phrase. "You don't just sing the note. You have to shape it. See? You start it soft, and then you glide, like you're sliding down a banister." Her voice hitting the notes but lacking the effortless grace of her grandmother's. "No, like this," Eleanor said, and she sang it again, her voice demonstrating the subtle art of phrasing. She wasn't just teaching a song. She was passing down a piece of history, a way of feeling music that couldn't be learned from a sheet. It was a wisdom that only a life lived could teach. Maya listened, captivated, not just by the music, but by the woman teaching it to her. She was seeing her grandmother in a completely new light, not just as a family elder, but as a master, an artist. In these moments, Eleanor wasn't just Maya's grandma. She was her teacher, her mentor. One evening, as they sat at the kitchen table, a pot of soup simmering on the stove, Eleanor looked at her granddaughter. The girl was humming softly, trying to perfect a run Eleanor had taught her. Eleanor watched her, a feeling of deep contentment settling over her. The house wasn't as quiet as it used to be. It was filled with music, with laughter, with the vibrant energy of a young life and a rediscovered old one. It was no longer a house of memories, but a home of new beginnings. The overnight sensation had faded from the headlines, but its impact remained. Eleanor Vance was still the woman who tended her garden and brought casseroles to her neighbors, but she was also a woman who had stood on a stage and silenced a crowd with a song. She was a woman who had learned that her quiet voice had a mighty power, not just to entertain, but to heal, to connect, and to give a voice to the feelings that so many people kept locked away. She hadn't set out to change her life. She had only done it to make her granddaughter happy. But in the process, she had found a new part of herself, part that had been waiting patiently in the wings for 78 years, just for the right moment to step into the light. The stage hadn't just given the audience a new song to love. It had given Eleanor a new voice with which to sing the rest of her life. And as she listened to Maya humming in the other room, she knew the song was far from over. It had only just found its chorus.